You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Wanted to turn to the left coast or the west coast, depending on how you refer to it, with all due respect to our friends and followers in British Columbia. But in BC, there was a rather dismal Supreme Court ruling, the BC Supreme Court the other day, in which they effectively said that if you try to get drug users out of playgrounds where children are congregating, it's somehow a violation of the drug users' constitutional rights. This is not just a reasonable concession that you could make while letting people do their drugs everywhere else in BC, which is the province's policy. No, it's a violation of their constitutional rights. So what more backwards and I will say authentic display of how British Columbia is viewing this than that ruling. And this comes at a time where there was a rather unique report that came out from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute by National Post columnist Adam Zivo, who's been on the show before, looking at the effects of BC's so-called safe supply policy. And if you followed this issue on this show or elsewhere in the past, you know that the word safe is a misnomer if ever there was one. But figured we'd delve into both of these issues. Adam Zivo returns here. Adam, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming back on.
Good to talk to you too. Thanks for having me back.
So let's just start with the Supreme Court ruling. I hear this is a system in Canada, the legal system, that will say that any constitutional right, if you want free speech, if you want freedom of expression, all of that is subject to all of these caveats and exceptions and carve-outs and balancing against other people's. And here we have an example where to say that we don't want drug users on playgrounds, you can just go 50 meters away. It doesn't seem like that big a concession, but they're saying, oh, no, drug users have rights.
Well, so their argument essentially is that if you ban people from using drugs in public spaces, that will encourage them to use alone. And then if they use alone, they're more likely to die of an overdose. Therefore, banning public drug consumption endangers drug users' lives in a way that is just not acceptable. That's a very questionable argument. I think that there isn't really any strong evidence behind that argument, from my understanding. And I think that if it really were the case that allowing people to use drugs in public decreased overdoses and deaths, you'd see that reflected in the overdose data in BC since they began their decriminalization experiments back about a year ago, but we haven't seen that. So I really questioned how the judge is coming to the conclusion that the argument made by harm reduction activists is a persuasive one.
Yeah, and I would say going back a year is one area, but BC has had for many, many years the most permissive approach to drugs anywhere in the country. We've had, the original fight over so-called harm reduction was a center in British Columbia, Insight, and that's going back close to 20 years now, maybe at least 15, 16 years. You've got these safe supply programs that have been in effect, and yet BC is still the worst as far as overdoses are concerned. So, the stated goal behind a lot of these programs just isn't panning out in the data.
Well, the problem is that for many BC addiction policymakers, they don't seem to actually care about real research. A lot of the research in this space is very low quality or, has often sometimes been biased. Even, for example, Insight, a lot of the research that was produced around that in 2003 to 2007 was produced by individuals who had lobbied for the creation of Insight to begin with. So there was a lot of conflict of interest there, and they were criticized for, coming to misleading conclusions. So you can look at the numbers here and you can say, well, obviously this isn't working, but these harm reduction activists don't seem to really care, right? All they'll say is that, well, that just means that we need more harm reduction. They don't see a lack of success as anything against them. They just see it as evidence of, of that we need more drugs.
Yeah, and you did in your report, and impeccably researched, by the way. It's like 36 pages. Now there's, credits and cover and all of that. But you did this report from Macdonald-Laurier Institute looking specifically at the Safe Supply fentanyl tablet program here. And first off, why did you focus in on that issue?
Well, I focused on the issue because I was emailed by two addiction physicians who thought the whole thing was ludicrous, right? And so essentially, since your listeners aren't fully familiar with this whole issue, starting in August, BC permitted the province-wide prescription of safe supply fentanyl tablets and sufentanil. And they did this really, quietly. There was no press release. There's been no media on it, which is really odd because usually harm reduction advocates advertise when they expand safer supply. And so I started looking into it, and I realized that the way that they were expanding safer supply fentanyl was grossly irresponsible. So the current system that we have today, where we distribute hydromorphone, which is basically heroin, is already broken because we don't require supervised consumption. So people sell their safer supply drugs on the streets. So we decided to give out fentanyl, and we decided to put in no requirement for safer, like for supervised consumption. So now we're creating a system that is set up to essentially flood communities with fentanyl in addition to government heroin, which I personally think is irresponsible, and I think many people would agree with me.
And I will say, it's not just a theoretical issue that these are ending up in the illegal drug trade. I mean, there have been a number of demonstrable cases in BC and also in Ontario where people can pretty well prove how these drugs are ending up just being trafficked.
Well, that's the thing, is that, so here's the thing. When it comes to scientific and formal studies of diversion, that's what they call it when this is sold to the streets. None of these studies are happening because harm reduction activists aren't interested in exploring this issue. And the federal government, despite throwing $100 million into safer supply, has not funded one study that seriously looks at diversion. The only research that's being done into diversion is essentially asking drug users who are on safer supply, do you divert? And if so, why? So obviously that's incredibly biased. Hey, are you selling your drugs? If so, why are you doing it? And they'll whitewash it. They'll say, oh, it's just mutual aid or whatever. So what I've been doing is I've been, for the past year, speaking to different stakeholder groups about safer supply. And I've just consistently been hearing from people that, yes, this diversion is happening. I heard that from over 30 addiction physicians. I interviewed former drug users in London, Ontario. I interviewed online drug users on Reddit who were openly selling safer supply and posting photos with prescriptions validating that safer supply. I've spoken with over 50 youth who talk about how hydromorphone is a big issue in their schools and how their peers are getting it from safer supply. So it's ridiculous to me that people are saying that this is not a big problem. But the thing is that our federal government and the BC government and these harm reduction activists do not care. It's like pointing to the sky and saying the sky is blue, and they say, well, how do you know that? It's completely irrational.
Is there? I think I may know the answer to this, but I may not. We had. I mean, when you were on the show previously, we had you alongside two experts who have themselves been very gung ho for harm reduction, and then eventually had a bit of buyer's remorse about that when they followed the data. But I'm wondering if among the people that are still advocates in general for harm reduction, if they're all the same, if they're all about this, this sort of wasteland approach that we see in BC, or are there moderates that, I guess, for lack of a better term, that are saying, well, hang on, I kind of agree in principle, but I can't go that far?
Well, I mean, so here's the thing. There's a lot of moderate people who are for harm reduction. Harm reduction itself is not a bad thing. It is a key pillar for addressing the opioid crisis, in addition to, let's say, prevention, treatment, and education. But it is a very big umbrella that includes a wide scope of intervention, some of which are better than others.
Well, yeah, I mean, just to interject there, it used to be that harm reduction was about the needles and the pipes you use, not the giving out drugs.
Yeah, look, harm reduction was championed in the late 80s and 90s, primarily by HIV researchers who wanted to decrease HIV infection rates because people were using dirty needles. And that was very effective. And you had needle exchange programs that demonstrably decreased rates of transmission for HIV and other bloodborne illnesses. And then these researchers ended up rebranding themselves as addiction experts in the 2000s and 2010s. And they started, implementing more questionable interventions. Many of the people I've spoken to, almost all of them accept the need for harm reduction in some capacity. And even some of them accept the need for safe supply in some capacity where it's much, much, much more tightly controlled than what we see today. So there's this wide gradient of approaches to harm reduction, but BC has taken the most extreme and most irresponsible one and then vilified anyone who opposes it as being, I don't know, some kind of backwards troglodyte, despite the fact that most of these people support harm reduction in some capacity.
What are their benchmarks for success? I mean, because again, even no matter how cynical I get, there must be some target that they're pointing to as evidence that it's working. What is that?
Okay. So there's 3 different kinds of studies that support safer supply, all of which are deeply flawed. So the first one is where they just interview drug users on safer supply. And when the drug users say, oh, this is great, it makes me happier, I'm overdosing less, they say, oh, that's objective evidence that this works. It's a customer testimonial. So that's not valid at all. The second level is doing quantitative studies, but the underlying data is still self-reported. So essentially, they hand out a whole bunch of surveys, say, rate from a scale of 1 to 10, how you feel about X, or has this happened to you in the past? Have you overdosed? Yada, yada, yada. And so you can crunch those numbers. So they're less open to misinterpretation than, let's say, an interview. But ultimately, self-reported data, the drug users know what kind of results they need, to continue having access to their drugs. So it's also not trustworthy. The third level, and this is the one that's more complicated for people to wrap their heads around. So there's a recent study that came out last year in Ontario that used Ontario's administrative health data to show that safer supply programs did have positive impacts on their clients. But there's a huge caveat here. So safer supply programs don't just give you free drugs, they also give you access to significant wraparound supports like social housing, primary care. Sorry, blanked out. There's a few other ones on top of that. But the study made no attempt to discern whether positive impacts came from the wraparound supports or the free drugs. So I'll just finish this monologue. The comparison would be like, imagine a really obese man, and you put him on a diet plan, and you give him access to a personal trainer, and you give him access to a life coach and a psychologist, and then you give him a free piece of cake once a week. And he loses weight, and you say, well, obviously giving cake is what caused him to lose weight. Well, no. So that's what this kind of study is like.
Yeah, there goes my New Year's strategy for weight loss. There, a cake a week keeps the pounds off. Well, no, that's quite fascinating. And the one thing I will also point out is that I don't hear in the rhetoric a lot of discussion about trying to get people off drugs as even being a goal. I mean, there's a fair bit of resignation that I think underlies a lot of these programs, which is, well, they're using them, so we just have to try to get the best outcomes within that.
Well, that's the thing, is that many people think that safer supplies is compassionate response. It's not compassionate. We're giving up on people. We're basically giving them palliative care, right? We're keeping them comfortable until they die, or until we can give them MAID. And then how is that compassionate? And look, theoretically, safer supply is meant to keep people alive until they seek treatments. But in practice, safer supply programs rarely push people towards recovery. I mean, it exists in the guidelines as a theoretical thing, but people just take their drugs and they sell it, and then they buy fentanyl until they die, and that's just horrific.
I know that your work on this in the past has been shared notably by Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader who's taken an interest in this. And I'm wondering, though, if there were a change in the federal government, how much of what's happening in BC could even change, and versus how much of it is squarely within the provincial jurisdiction?
I'm actually not entirely sure about the distinction between the federal and provincial jurisdiction here.
It's murky. That's the best I've been able to unearth myself on this.
Well, here's the thing. So safer supply is provided in two main ways. So way one is through federally funded programs. And these can be forced into provinces. There are provinces that have resisted safer supply, and the federal government has still funded programs operating within them. Though I think Alberta has effectively banned safer supply regardless of the federal government's intentions. And then on the second level, the provincial government can incentivize people to uptake safer supply, or they can, for example, create protocols that allow regular prescribers to prescribe safer supply. So you just, your regular doctor, it's outside of a specialized program. If the federal government changes, all the funding for safer.
There goes our clean tag on iTunes. It's been a good run.
All the federal funding for safer supply will go away, and all of these projects which create really terrible research will be they'll be offline, which will be great. And what I would love to see is a federally funded investigation into safer supply and federally funded studies into the harms of safer supply. And I think it'll be politically difficult for provinces to defend safer supply once they lose federal support, because what that'll mean is that addiction physicians will start speaking out more. Many of them are worried about losing access to federal grants. It means that as more knowledge comes out, more people are going to sue provincial governments. I know that there are people who are looking into lawsuits right now. And number three, just, once you have more kids and drug users and more evidence coming out, this is a disaster. No one wants to lose their government. I know that the BC NDP is very worried about a conservative resurgence. So I think that if Safer Supply starts imploding, they would definitely abandon ship.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. And even just on the playground topic that we started on, I mean, that's an issue where parents that otherwise don't care about this are going to all of a sudden become very concerned when they can't even take their kids to the playground. And already I hear from people emailing and saying, oh, my son or daughter is in university in Toronto and is scared to take the subway. Like this has just become a fact of life now in Canada, and that is not sustainable. Adam Zivo, great report for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute on this, and also great work in the National Post always. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.